and service existing roads. Okay? There's a lot of those things, and it's sort of more roads, there's good and bad. I mean, it provides jobs, it's more infrastructure, that's good. But you're going to lose some of that sense of community. My main office is in Steamboat Springs, and the truth is, I'm a lawyer. I also have a real estate license, although I don't practice real estate. And when I talk to realtors in Steamboat, I tell them, look, Craig and Hayden are positioned for growth in a much, much better way than Steamboat Springs. And boy, it's like that's heresy to people in Steamboat, but it's really true. And the reason is Steamboat is built on a tourist economy that, to be blunt, is collapsing. Okay, and I could probably spend another 2 hours talking about that. But Craig and Hayden is really at the very first stages of a growth phase that, if you would come back in 20 years, there are going to be a lot of things that you really won't recognize about your town. Okay? Costs and benefits. Okay? All right, so let's talk about why I'm saying this. All right, some of this I've touched over, but I'm going to get in a little more detail here. The political instability abroad is very, very, very troubling. Okay, we spend a lot of time thinking about, places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but look, there are other bigger problems than that. I mean, Mexico, which is a huge oil producer, is about 3 inches away from anarchy, from what I can tell, and we don't really pay attention to that. We being the media, you really don't hear much about that. But that's a mess. Places like Nigeria, which are major oil producers. I mean, if I went through the room, even myself, if you ask me basic questions, who is the leader of Nigeria? I'd say, I don't know. But you know what? They produce a boatload of oil, all right? And we live in a time where, unfortunately, some of the best oil reserves are also beneath the most poorly run countries in the world that are really ripe for revolution. We were talking about Libya a few minutes ago. Maybe I'm wrong, and I can be a little flip on these things, but back when we invaded Iraq, someone posed, why do you think we invaded Iraq? And I tell people, because we couldn't invade Saudi Arabia. And people would say, well, what does that mean? And it's like, well, what does it mean? It means that 13 of the 16 people involved in 9/11, at least the ones, they were all Saudi Arabians. It's basically a dictator, as my best friend Mark calls. It's a thugocracy. What we're really seeing right now is in the international oil industry, one of the big concerns is what precisely are the reserves of the Saudis? Because the Saudis have had to spend a boatload of money on social programs over the last 15 years because they have a country with a huge amount of the population less than age 35. And instead of spending their money on further developing oil fields, they're spending it on social programs. And there comes a point where that just does not work. So, we're not at what I would call the tipping point, but I think the policymakers all understand that it's just a matter of time before some jihadist straps on the dynamite, walks up to the pipeline, and we now have an international incident. And the price of oil shoots from 85 to 200 literally overnight. Okay? I hope it doesn't happen, but if it does, I'm not terribly surprised. And the policymakers in our country know all this. Okay? So there is a major shifting in our policy looking at not only natural gas but oil. It's like, look, we got to stop doing this. Okay? So things that are going. The other thing I need to add is because of fracking and horizontal drilling, the known reserves in the United States of natural gas are at an all-time high by a factor of about 2.5 times. Okay, we've got tons of natural gas. But as we talked about before, our reserves of oil are increasing for the first time since the 1960s. Because now we're going back and we're evaluating. In fact, there's a niche industry in oil and gas that deals with shut-in wells, abandoned wells, and how can we go in and extract what was left, because the technology's improved so much. In fact, if you go down to Rio Blanco County and Moffat County and Western Routt County, there's a huge number of wells that are just sitting there. That if someone wants to go in and do a workover well and do some things, they'll probably produce them. They'll probably produce better than they ever have in the past. Okay, so we've got this situation where we have a very uncertain international situation. We're very fearful the international reserves are overstated, and our reserves are a lot better. Back to the deficit, and back to the trade deficit. The politicians realize it's unsustainable to spend as much as we do for foreign energy. I mean, you just can't keep doing it. It's nuts politically. It's nuts economically. And people that are sort of in the business are saying, look, before we had to do it because we had no choice. I mean, the feeling was, up until recently, that the net reserves in the United States would never be able to significantly satisfy our demand. Well, people are looking at that and they're saying, you know what? Because of the increase in technology, yeah, there's going to come a point where we can't be a petroleum laden society. But now they're saying, hey, it's not as bad as we thought. It looks a lot better now than it has really since the oil embargo in '74. So, you start looking at those things. Let's go to taxes for a second. And this is kind of an odd issue, and I could put you to sleep for a long time. But the oil and gas industry has a very, very different system of taxation than any industry in our country. And you'll hear, I guarantee, when we start going through these political debates over the next year, you're going to hear someone ask someone, but how about that depletion allowance that you hear about oil and gas? Oh, we're going to have to do away with that. That's just a windfall profit for those guys. Don't believe it for a second. We're going to see a couple things. Unfortunately, taxes are going to increase in our country. Okay, you just can't keep doing what we've been doing. Taxes are going up. Okay, so what's going to happen is traditional tax strategies are not going to be viable because those avenues have been closed by our legislators to increase tax revenue. One that is not are all these oil and gas incentives. Okay, and the reason is oil and gas is a very, very risky investment. Okay, and they've tried. The Carter administration tried to, scale some things back, and it just proved to really be disastrous to industry. So I think what we're going to see is two things simultaneously. You're going to see alternative tax strategies that people have been using be closed. You're going to see the existing oil and gas advantages remain open because that creates incentive for people to invest in the oil and gas industry. So what's going to happen is the doctors and the lawyers or the bankers, whoever they are, they're looking for, okay, how do I tax plan? They're going to be looking at oil and gas in a big way. So you're going to see more money flowing into the sector, which is going to change the dynamics of what goes on. So the tax structure has a lot to do with what's going to be happening in the future. As I mentioned, job creation. There are going to be a lot of jobs from, landmen to geologists to petroleum engineers to roughnecks. I mean, look, right now, it's not just the housing industry in Steamboat Springs or Craig or wherever. It's horrible. It's across the country. And we have such a huge inventory that, that thing's not going to get absorbed for a long time. I mean, I don't know if it's 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or whatever it is, but it's not happening overnight. And, we don't think about it, but, every time there's a well pad, you got to get a construction crew out there. I mean, you got to, You're employing engineers, civil engineers to design the roads. I mean, there are a lot of jobs, and they're good jobs. Okay, and they're jobs that are going to stay in the United States. So you're going to see a huge amount of emphasis on those things. And at the same time, you know, there are a lot of ranchers that have gotten nice big checks just in the past year, and amounts more than they could have ever believed. And that's also good for the local economy. You know, I mean, there are people, you know, I mentioned before, I mean, I've got clients out there that it's like, holy cow. You know, they offered me $35 an acre 7 years ago. You're telling me $350 an acre is too low? You can get me more? And it's like, yeah, you know, it's just, I don't make the market, I'm just telling you what the market is. Okay? That's good because that puts money in people's pocket that helps move the economy. All right? So, and then, you know, the last thing, you know, that I would mention is just, you know, back on the deficit again. You know, the decades of the United States being the world's policeman, I think are kind of coming to an end. I don't think, I mean, I would be glad to sit here and discuss this with anyone for any length, but I mean, I still have no idea why we're in Afghanistan, and I've not heard a lot of good explanations. But it doesn't matter what I think. I think what's going to happen as we move forward, Congress is going to be far, far less willing to get involved in those types of things. And I think our Congress knows, hey, as long as we're involved in these countries in the Mideast, we're entangled. And the only way we can unentangle ourselves is we have to be much, much more dependent upon our own natural resources, our own energy. So, you know, when I start going through all these different things, you know, like I said, this kind of is the tip of the iceberg, guys. You know, what you're seeing now. And I'm not saying, too, it's not like one big up. Okay, it's, you know, there are ups and downs. Okay, there are going to be some waggles. But generally speaking, the growth curve is going to go up. And, you know, you're just dealing with too many issues occurring simultaneously. You know, you're dealing with the economy, you're dealing with international sources, you know, you're just dealing with a lot of things that, you know, it's going to happen. So anyway, those are my comments. You know, I've got, you know, 25 to the hour. I invite questions, whatever you may want to ask. I'm more than willing to at least try to tackle. And you can ask me legal questions too, you know. Yeah, and sorry, what's your name?
Roberta.
Okay,
Fox.
Roberta.
Yeah. I have a question. What would be the difference between Routt County and Moffat County as far as the regulations for the oil company?
Very good question. Generally speaking, COGCC has the exclusive right in Colorado to regulate. Okay? There have been a series of cases that have gone up to the Supreme Court that have said you can have local regulation as long as the regulation is not intended to, for lack of a better term, hamstring the oil and gas industry. Because what was happening was down in La Plata County, Durango, the local county commissioners were coming up with regulations that dealt with roads and noise and all these different things that, you know, they're very sophisticated. They're like, oh no, this has everything to do with quality of life. This has nothing to do with necessarily bringing oil and gas industry to a halt. And, you know, the Supreme Court said, wait a second, guys, no, we're not. You know, if you have legitimate areas of regulation, fine, but don't cross the line. So that sounds great, too, as a matter of policy. The implementation is a little different. I mean, I can tell you that the permitting process, I mean, first of all, we're not seeing nearly as much in Routt as we're seeing in Moffat. Okay, and to the extent we're seeing it in Routt, where we're really seeing it right now is, you know, outside of Hayden, and now we're starting to see it down, you know, through the Oak Creek area, okay? But we're not getting a lot of permits. But, you know, the industry people I talk to are already saying, they're like, hey, we're not wild about these Routt County guys. They're requiring a lot more. You know, we hope we don't have a problem.
So who's requiring more?
The county commissioners.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the county commissioners. Each county has the right to regulate things like road use, noise, ambient things like dust, whatever it may be. And like I said, the Supreme Court said you can regulate that stuff. We don't have a problem. You have a legitimate interest. Don't you cross that line. Okay, you leave industry alone. You let them develop.
What about the city? Does like Steamboat Springs proper, Hayden proper, Oak Creek proper, can they get their fingers in that, or do they have to go through the COGCC? I know that they have
they could if they wanted to. It's a practical matter. No one wants to drill in the city limits of Steamboat or Hayden. Okay,
What about
it's
Craig?
just. Pardon me?
What about Craig?
Oh, I think it's a real.
Do they want to drill here?
Oh, I
in
think
the city limits?
I think Craig creates a much different environment, but a lot of the environment, it's like I said before. You got to go where the resource is. I mean, the difference is I don't know of any known, oil or gas resources in the city limits of Steamboat Springs, because we're kind of in the valley. We got some elevation. I mean, your topography here is very, very different. I mean, what we do know, not so much from Craig, but from places like Rifle, is when industry has seen an opportunity that was merited as far as coming in the city limits, they've done that. Okay, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. To the extent you got to remember, industry has shareholders; they have duty to their shareholders. But boy, that's where things get really touchy politically, and not that industry asks my thoughts on these things, but boy, to the extent I would say, be very careful about doing that. I mean, if you actually have to for compelling reasons, maybe. But boy, you got so many holes you can drill in Moffat County. Why are you doing it? Why are you doing this? So, but at some point, I think that you are going to see that type of stuff. Not today or tomorrow. But yes.
I had a question about horizontal drilling.
Yes.
Now, if they drilled on your property and they went horizontal and they went to your neighbor's property, what would happen with the leasing rights? Would they contact that neighbor if they went clear over on their property, or how does that work?
Well, I'll give you the legal answer, and then I'll give you the practical answer. Is that first of all, when you get your drilling permit, you in advance have to tell COGCC so they can evaluate the permit exactly where you're going in at the surface, but also where you're going to end up in the ground. Okay? What you described is a classic trespass. Okay? I would really doubt they would do that. Okay? What instead they would do is one of two things. They would either go to the owner and say, we'd like to lease your property, or if the circumstances were such, they would submit to COGCC a plan to unitize and saying, hey, we want to use this property as part of our drilling plan. And as part of the unitization, the neighbor would be compensated for royalties. But they would, they would lose it.
They would do it beforehand then?
Oh, yeah, they would do it all in advance. I mean, you hear crazy situations where things happen, but, generally speaking, the industry does not want to get involved in these litigations. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who's a professor, and one of the things he does is he teaches at this institution in Reno, Nevada, that he calls Baby Judge School. I forget the name of it. And he does the teaching for the Baby Judge School. And he always laughs. He goes, it's the easiest class in the world to teach. And I go, why is that, Patrick? And he goes, you just tell them, industry always loses. Okay? and it's kind of like jokey in a way, but industry is very reluctant to bring cases in front of juries. Okay? They just don't like that dynamic. And because of that dynamic, it's very poisonous. They don't like the bad relations. It's expensive. And they don't have a good track record. So my experience with industry is they really do a pretty outstanding job to avoid those types of problems. Because, see, they don't care because they're going to have to pay the royalty anyway. The only difference is who gets the royalty. Okay, what names are in the division? So, is it possible that they would, stick something in there and pull it out? Yeah, it's possible, but they wouldn't do it. There's no upside.
Well, I just wondered how
Oh yeah. Well, you hear stories, so, there's some interesting stories like in Texas back in the 30s, and people did crazy stuff, but it's a different era. I mean, they can look at a 3D map and they know exactly where that stem ends. They know to the degree, the minute, the second. They know precisely where it is. I mean, they know it the same way as you're watching a golf tournament on Sunday afternoon. You know where that ball is compared to the hole. They know with the same specificity. So that's a good question. Yes, sir.
What on these surface agreements? Just
Yes.
There's. It just says that it's to the agreement of both parties. Really, it doesn't. There's no.
Well, let me kind of back you through a couple of different things. Okay, the first thing I tell you is, if you go to my website, there's a part of the website that deals with publications. There's actually a paper I did that deals just with surface use agreements. Okay, that covers this well more in depth. But here's kind of the lay of the land. The first thing you have to identify is, does the owner of the surface also own the minerals? Okay? Because if you have unification of the resource, you have a totally different situation. The more problematic situation is, Grandpa sold the ranch but withheld the minerals. Grandpa died, left the minerals to the kids and then the grandkids. And now you've got the minerals being leased, but the surface owner has none of the minerals. Okay, now you've got development. Okay? Now, if you own both the minerals and the surface, I still recommend do an oil and gas lease and do a surface use agreement. Okay, because the document you see more often than not is the producer's 88. And the producer's 88 doesn't really deal with a lot of the surface use areas. Okay? So I always say that. But if you don't have the minerals and you have the surface, as a matter of Colorado law, before you file your well permit, the operator has to certify that he's made a good faith effort with you to negotiate a surface use agreement. Okay? Now, a surface use agreement is like any other type of contract. It really depends on what you negotiate. So when I represent owners, the first thing I do is a pretty extensive inventory. It's like, how many acres do you have? What are you using it for? Because, everything's different. If I'm representing someone that has, alfalfa and is doing a hunting operation, that can be a lot different than if they're doing a cow and calf operation, which is different than the guy that, has 120 acres and he has a house, and he's got a couple horses, but he's really not doing anything agricultural. So then you got to sit down and figure out, the use of the property in such a way that you have a good balance between the rights of the oil and gas company that's doing the developing and the rights of the surface owner. And we write some of them, and they're long. They can be like 15 pages, where we'll go through and we'll say, look, this is the type of fence you have to use. This is the type of road base. You kind of go through that. And what I tell people is, oddly enough, industry generally does not mind going through that. And the reason is, the more definition you have in a surface use agreement, they know what to do. Okay, the good thing about contracts is a well-written contract will provide certainty to you. So, we try to get in there, so-called roll up our sleeves and negotiate all these different terms and conditions, but you got to think about water usage. You got to make sure that, wells aren't being harmed, either as a matter of quality or quantity. You got to deal with roads and fences, and where do you put in well pads? And, there are hosts. What do you do with wastewater? There's a laundry list of issues that we deal with. So, go back to your question. Yeah, some of them can be pretty thin, but this is what I tell people though, and take this for what it's worth. There are not a lot of lawyers in Northwest Colorado that really do oil and gas work. I know a couple lawyers that, they'll negotiate leases to do stuff, and I know them because they're kind of friends of mine, and they'll call and they ask me questions. But, you know, you don't have to hire me, but, you know, do yourself a favor. If you actually have a real God-honest oil and gas issue, hire someone that knows oil and gas law, okay? I mean, your family lawyer may be a heck of a good guy on a lot of different things, but, I mean, there are very, very few lawyers in the Western Slope that truly understand these things. So, you know, if you're in a situation where, you know, you have a surface use that really doesn't say anything, boy, that concerns me just as, you know, someone that does this type of work, because good surface use agreements benefit everyone. Okay, it also benefits people down the road. You sell your property or you give it to your kids.
Okay, the stuff that you mentioned was if you owned both, right?
No, even if you just own the surface. In fact, if you own only the surface use agreement is even more important. Okay, because those are, you know, you're entirely dependent on the surface. And to be honest, you're very indifferent about what happens as far as the extraction.
Okay, but how willing are they to work with you?
Again, every case is different. By and large, I find them to be pretty darn reasonable. Okay, I mean they're not going to give you the ranch, so to speak, but if you're able to meaningfully articulate what your priorities are, and you can come up with a scheme involving adequate compensation, we don't have a lot of problems. Okay, because the one thing industry doesn't want to do is, if they're not successful with the surface use agreement, then they're left with the common law and what I told you about before, the accommodation doctrine. And the problem with those things is like negligence. Sometimes you don't know whether you're negligent or not until the jury comes back and tells you you were negligent. Okay, that's not a good environment for anyone to be in. Okay, the other thing that's bad about a surface use, or I'm sorry, about not having a surface use agreement is, if you're the landowner, you're going to be responsible for all your attorney's fees and costs, and that can be very, very burdensome because generally industry has a lot more money. That's not always the case. I mean, I definitely have some clients that have a ton of money, but generally speaking, you know, the operator's in a superior financial position. Now, long story short, if you got to spend 5, 10, 15, 25 grand on a lawyer, the burden on you is going to be completely different than the burden on them. Okay, but you know, just to make sure I'm clear on this, you know, if you have the surface and not the minerals, then again, you can't make them do a surface use agreement. All you can do is try to negotiate. I would say do your best to do it. If you have both the surface and the minerals, even though you can deal with the surface issues in your oil and gas lease, I think the better way to do it is you have a separate surface use agreement and a separate oil and gas lease. Okay? And then if all you own is the minerals, then you probably don't even care about the surface. I mean, not to be flip, but that's the reality. Typically, if I'm dealing with someone that has just the minerals, it literally is, hi, I am calling from Beaufort, South Carolina. You know, my dad had this property up Trout Creek and da-da-da. I mean, they don't even live here. I mean, they just get something in the mail. So, yes?
Well, just to follow up with this question, so if you own the surface, you
Yes.
own at least part of your mineral rights,
Yep.
but you really don't want them on your surface because it might be a small area, or
Mhm.
you might have close neighbors.
Mhm.
You can put in there no surface occupancy, correct?
If you can successfully negotiate
If
it.
you can
Yeah,
successfully
yeah, and we
negotiate.
see that. I mean, you know, the common example will be, hey, I've got 5 acres. I don't care, you know, if you do, but don't come on my 5 acres. I think I was talking about this at break, is the average well pad consumes about 4 acres. Once you get the drill rig off there, you know, you can call it down to about 1 1/4 acres. So, you know, if you've got a 10-acre parcel, and they're actually drilling on your land, boy, that's going to be a real imposition. But the other thing, too, is that the way the regs are, and if anyone wants this stuff, go to the COGCC website, it's the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. They've got all the regs and everything. But
It's in the 300 series, isn't it?
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. The 300 series goes through the types of things you have to do to get your well permit, what's permitted, what's not. So, I mean, if you have a small enough piece of property, I mean, I'll give you kind of a weird example, but it could be true. Let's say I owned 1/4 of an acre of land. Well, the way the regs are and all the setbacks, you could not ever drill on that quarter acre. You couldn't use part of it. I mean, it would be impossible for the regs. But, you know,